Good.
So, yes.
Now, if you remember last time, we're talking about the Hasidic insights into Shir HaShirim. Shir HaShirim is a song that King Solomon wrote. It's not just a song, it's the song of songs. The song of songs, Shir HaShirim. Shir HaShirim, the ultimate, the song of songs, the ultimate song, the source of all songs. The source of all songs that came through King Solomon. Okay, I mean, on one hand, you can ask yourself, that's all King Solomon has to do. The wisest man in the world is to write songs. Well, he's a songwriter. That's his whole thing, writing songs. Write, deep. And why did he call this into a song? What is a song? It's just this deep insights in mystical things and something. So it doesn't make any sense. So the Rebbe says, this is a song that was written, a wedding song. It was a wedding song that was written for the big wedding. It was the wedding between God and the Jewish people. King Solomon, he was the king of the Jewish people. He was the representative of the Jews. And the whole thing of the Jews is God. Not the Jewish religion. But every single Jew and all the Jews all together, that's their whole thing is connected to God. Therefore, the Jewish people are likened to the bride. They're likened to the bride. And God is likened to the groom. So says the Rebbe, a bride and a groom, this is a very intimate and dynamic relationship. Nowadays the world is trying to make this thing, cheap. Relations between a man and a woman. Maybe there's no such thing as men. There's no such thing as women. Everybody just sort of want to do what you want to. But that's a big, how do you call it, a perversion. And worse than being a perversion, it's external. It's external. That what the world is doing to God and to relationships and things like that, as that is a big perversion, and it's external. It's like it's cruel. It's insensitive to what God really is, and to what true love is. That's the point. That's really the point. What is true love? So this is the source of all love. Source of all love. Nothing is more valuable when it comes down to it. Nothing is more valuable than love. Love is the essence of life. Love. When you love something, you value it. If there's no love, it means there's no value to anything. Nothing is valuable. Everything. That was a big thing with the communists, with the Nazis, with this. Life is, people are just animals, there's nothing to value. There's no value, no love, no care, no mercy, there's no love. So this is the ultimate love connection. One second, am I recording this stuff?
Yes.
Yeah. So that's ultimately this. So that's what's going on over here. He's talking about the source of all love. Source of all love. And who are the lovers over here? Us and God. And God is the creator. There's no bigger love than that. And God is creating us. He's creating us, but there is bigger love than that. Just that he's creating us is not enough. God also gave us the Torah. And when he gave us the Torah, he put himself into it. He really put himself into the Torah. He put his whole soul. Ana nafshi katavit yahavit. I put my soul. I put into the Torah. That's the little anochi, the first word of the Torah. So it's love. Says the Rebbe. There's different levels of this. You want to call it love, even more. We call it reality, right? Like we said, value. Something's value, life. And that comes, first of all, from the Jewish people. The Jewish people were called the Kala. We're called the bride. So let's take it from our point of view. What is expected from us as the bride of God? Every Jew is the bride. I mean, I know this idea has been twisted and how do you say, misused. But the fact is, all the Jewish people are the bride of God. Being the bride of God does not mean you can't get married, right? To a person, exactly the opposite. If you're the bride of God, you want to do what God wants you to do. So here we go. There's two types of love, and that's implied by two meanings of the word kala. Kala means a bride. Remember, we learned this last time. I'm just going over it. One is kala means to expire, to be negated, to totally dissolve yourself in God. God is so real, so infinite, and we're so finite and so unreal, and that just thinking about the reality of God, you just realize that you're nothing. That's one meaning of kala. Then there's another meaning of kala, means like nichsav v'kalim kalu sanafshi, desire, chuka, a tremendous desire for God. So on one hand, we have, and how do you call it, a dissolving of ourselves in God. We just realize I'm nothing. I just realize I'm nothing at all in God. And the other one is that I am something, but God is like really, really valuable, really valuable. So it's, if you want to call it, it's like two types of love. One is a love from us that we just totally dissolve ourselves in the oneness of God, totally dissolved. And the other one is that we have tremendous appreciation for God, and that's what you have to think about God, and you have to meditate about God, and then you have to love God with all of your heart and all of your might, all of your soul. That's Shema Yisrael. The word Shema means to think, understand. That's this lower type of love. So the Rebbe said this basically is related to two different types of godliness. One is called Mamali Kolmim, the other one's called Sovim Kolmim. Mamali Kolmim is how God fills the world, how there's different levels of godliness. There's this world, there's the higher worlds, there's higher, more real worlds, and there's the angels, the different levels of angels. And by understanding these different levels, it raises us up to higher and more inclusive and more, how do you say, genuine types of love of God, loving God with all of your heart, higher than that is all of your soul, higher than all of your might. So that's levels of God. But the first level we talked about, there's no levels. It's just totally expiring. No matter how much I try to understand, I cannot possibly understand God. God creates me. I don't create him. I have absolutely no idea what God is. God is infinitely more real than I can possibly imagine. That's called expiring. So that's called Soviv Kolmim. Okay, that's basically what we got up to. Let's go. Hine, behold, from these two levels of Kala, where are we there? My magic fire pointer over here. There we go. Hine. Hello?
Yes. Sov Kol Almin goes to the love of dissolvement, and Memale Kol Almin is the love of meditation.
Yes. Maybe in English, I think it's more proper the word contemplation than meditation. Meditation usually means you take one little point and you try to think into it. And contemplation means you're solving a problem. Something is very, for instance, God creates me. I don't feel it. That's a problem. How can I not? Here he's saying that God is infinitely real. I don't feel that. It's a problem. Why don't I feel it if God is creating me and God is infinitely real? But that's a problem. So you think into it. What does it mean? Right? What do those ideas mean? What is it? Is it really real? God is really conducting the world. Is that really true? Is it not really true? That's what it means. Contemplation. You contemplate in order to solve a problem that you have. Something that's very meaningful. Meditation is usually to get out of the world. And contemplation is more like to solve a problem in the world. Something like that the world makes sort of more sense a little bit. That's what so contemplation is something that I grasp. That's the first, that's the second level we're talking about. I grasp it. And the other level that's Soviv Kolmim is I am grasped. God is more real than me. I can't possibly understand. That's totally, when you call it, dissolving yourself in God. That's Soviv Kolmim. And Mamali Kolmim is understanding God a little bit, getting excited about God. Mamali Kolmim. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here we go. From these two levels of Kala, from these levels, from our arousal from below, for these two different types of Kala we talked about, being totally dissolved in God or really, really appreciating and loving God. Sometimes, by the way, it's called Ahava Rabba and Ahavat Olam. There's other Maimorim. Ahavat Olam means you think about God in relation to the world. And Ahava Rabba means that you think of how God is totally beyond the world. All the worlds are like nothing to God. Same basic idea. Okay, from these two arouses that we have, that's the Kala, that's the bride. God reacts, and that's the two levels of the Chatan, of the groom. And the word Chatan comes from the word Chut Darga. Chatan means to come down. That's what we say in the blessing. The last blessing under the wedding canopy. It says the sound, the voice of the melody of the chatanim, of the grooms in their chuppah. Chuppah is like the wedding canopy. Chatanim, the grooms, two types of grooms, corresponding to the two reactions, how God reacts to our love. If our love is one that's totally consuming in God, is that God reacts in this total Soviv Kolmim way in the world. If our love is one that is based on some sort of understanding and grasping of God, that's called Ahavat Olam, as then God also reacts accordingly with a blessing from Mamali Kolmim, how God fills the world. So there's two types of reaction to our reaction, two types of groom in reaction to the bride, two types of bride. Let's explain this. This is what we say in, what is it? Bruch Shamar, right? Melech Mufuar b'Shabach Bruchato Hashem Melech Muhul B'Tishbachot. That's what we say in Bruch Shamar. Yes. No. Melech Meshulal Muhulal B'Tishbachot. That's what we say. Yes, Bruch Shamar. Meshubach and Fu'ar was, yes, that's right. Meshubach. Oh, he says here it doesn't have a Meshubach and Fu'ar Arei Ad Shema at all. Here it says a little bit different. Yeah, that's right. Mefu'ar Arei Ad Shema. That's right. Bruch Shamar. Okay, so what's going on? What do we say in Bruch Shamar? Let's look at this a little bit. We say God is a king, and He is praised, and He is a Mefu'ar, like exalted forever and ever. His great name. His great, what does it mean? His great name. Great name. He's got a great name. What is a regular name is not good. It has to be a great name. That's what he's going to ask. What does it mean? Shmei HaGadol. What does it mean? His big name. What, he has a big name and a little name. Became Tzarech Love, and we also have to understand what does it mean? Ad Shalom Nivro Olam. Before God created the world, there was Him and His name were alone. How could God have a name before Ad Shalom Nivra, before the world was created? It didn't have anyone to call Him His name. How could He have a name? Mainly you can name, let's say, a baby before the baby is born. Right? You could say the name of the baby. If it's a boy, we'll call him Yehuda. If it's a girl, we'll call it Yehudit. But there's someone to call the name. His parents are there. But how can there be God have a name before there's any creation? What does it mean? There's no one who calls Him His name. God's mother, or what does it make no sense? What does it mean? God is the creator of all being. How could it be that he had a name before he created any people to call that name? What does it mean, his great name? Yuvan, we can understand. Al Pima should know that what it says, Hashem Yisparech, that God is called in the Gemara and the Midrashim by the name of Kodesh Baruch Hu. Let's take this name of God called the Holy One, blessed be He. In order to understand what does it mean is God's name before God created the world, what does it mean his name? Let's understand there's a term, an appellation that's given to God, that God is called the Holy One, blessed be He. Shebacharu b'shem zeh, that the rabbis chose this name, v'lo b'shem usukinuim acharim, and not in other names like Rachum v'Chanun. Right? Very, very common to call God a Kodesh Baruch Hu. Kodesh Baruch Hu. Very rare do we see that we call God Rachum, the merciful one, the bountiful one. We call him the Holy One, blessed be He. Lefi, because why is this name so good? Kodesh Baruch Hu. This indicates Shehu Kodesh Muvdal, that God is Kodesh. Kodesh means he's something totally different from anything in the world. Kodesh means he's not part of the creation in any way. Kodesh, nothing in the creation is anything like him. He's Kodesh. He's removed. The Ein Aroch, there's no comparison, Hamshachos Yislabshus or in soul, to him, to this godliness which is drawn from him. It's like taking one little drop of the Atlantic Ocean and saying, here's what the Atlantic Ocean looks like. Right? So it looks exactly the same thing as in a fish bowl. No big deal. Atlantic Ocean. Right? I turn on my faucet, Atlantic Ocean. Right? Of course, that's ridiculous. Atlantic Ocean has trillions, billions, who knows, of tons of water. You take one little drop, it doesn't show anything. The same thing, the creative force which God uses to create the world, this is like a little drop in relation to God. And that's a very bad example because the ocean is made up a lot of drops of water, but God is not made up a lot of these rays or God's words or God's names. They don't make God. That's what the rabbis say, Kodesh Baruch Hu, the God, he sits and he learns Torah. What does it mean? The God's essence is totally separate from the world. But when he's Yoshev, when he comes down and he brings himself down, then he can put himself into the Torah. Ka'anam Yoshev, like a person who sits down, umashpil komoto, and he lowers down his stature. So the Kodesh, God has to come down, so to speak. Arouse, this ray of godliness that comes into the world to create the world, or even to give the Torah, this is called God's name. It is only a ray of godliness. After all, the Torah is just another book in the library, right? It's just a book made of. And that's what it means that before this is what written by the Tzemach Tzedek. And also this thing of that the before the world was created was him and his name alone. Namely, this is the source, the origin, and God's ability, his potential, which is in Ein Sof, which is in God, that there can be revelation of this ray of godliness. That's what it means, God's name before the world was created. It's potential. And God is the potential that from him can be the world. Yes.
What's the Pirush at Masayis Baruch Kadosh Muvdal Ele Sheyashav Mashpil? And then there's an abbreviation, Aleph Ein. I cannot.
1 minute. It's at that small.
As that small.
Shoshet, that he cut Mashpil, he lowers himself down. Liyo, to be, mitlabesh, clothed in the Torah.
Okay.
So God's essence is totally, totally above the world, and it's totally above the Torah. But on the other hand, God does create the world, and he does give the Torah. So how does he do that if that's not God's essence? So it says God has this ability to hide himself. Hide himself. God can hide himself. They call it the tzimtzum, contract, if you want to call it. But nevertheless, what we get is just a little tiny ray of reality. Good?
Yes.
And that's what we call God's name before the world was created. That's God's potential to contract himself, if you want to call it, to hide himself, to hide his light. God doesn't really hide himself. He hides his light, he hides whatever he hides. In any case, to conceal his oneness, his reality from the world, the ability of him to do this, God to do that, that's called God's name, as it was included in him before he created the world. Hainu, Hamakar, the source and the origin, and God's ability that there is in Ein Sof Baruch Hu, Sheyochal, that he is able to be Gilui, this revelation of Ziv Ha'ora. Sheyeh Mimena, that can be a ray from him, creating the worlds. This idea to make the worlds rose up in God's desire and his will. We say, so what are we doing over here? We Jewish people, we have an obligation that began from Abraham to teach the whole world what God is. Why? Because God's creating everybody. That's really true reality. There is no other reality except for God. That's all there is. Anything that exists is being created by God all the time. And our job is to convince people to worship and connect to this God. But first we have to convince ourselves. So the Rebbe is trying to explain to us the oneness of God. What does it mean that God is one? How is it that this world, which is so incredibly complex, this is all part of God's oneness, you want to call it. God is creating it all the time. So the Rebbe says, because the world is being created by, if you want to call it, a ray of reality. So the world is like 3 steps removed from true reality. God is true reality, and then God makes this ray, which is a secondary reality. And from this ray, which is also called God's name, is there also comes this world, which is a 3rd level of reality. And really, there's not just the 3rd level, there's thousands and thousands of levels of reality, each one less real than the one before it. And all these are called God's name. Right? Now we're talking about this thing of the Kala, means that we want to get to the source of God. We realize how unreal this world is and how real God is and how good God is. And we just want to get to the source. That's the Kala that we talked about before. What's the Chassan? That's how God comes down and reveals his essence through this ray. He stops making the concealment. He reveals his big name, the source of all of this creation in the world. He stops, so to speak, concealing himself, stops. Okay, so let's just drop down over here. All of this ability of God to contract himself, this is called God's name. That's what it says, Koach Adoni. He says, Yignal na Koach Adoni. Moses said, make your power great. What does it mean? That God's great power, the more it gets closer to God's essence, is the more real this power of God that he conceals, the less concealment there is. Because mehuto vatzmuto, that God's essence does not come down into the world at all, etc. Therefore, koach umakar, the power and the source of this is called God's name, as it is concealed in God. That's God's name, his name. And from this name comes all these rays and things like that create the world. And that's what it means, that with you is the source of light. Life. It's just with you, God. That's what's with you. God's name is with him. And from this name comes all the light. And that's what it means in Yeshem HaGadol. That's what it means, God's big name. God's big name is above the whole entire chain of creation. Ushmo HaGadol, that's God's big name. This is what we want from our prayers, is to be Meshubach and Far Adiyad, to make it revealed and praised to the lowest levels. Ein Sof. That God is alone. Oh, other way around. Not so. Sometimes it means Adayad, means to come down. In this case, it means to go up. This name of God is higher and higher. Meshubach and Adayad is praiseworthy and it's glorious for the highest of highest levels. This is Ein Sof. That's this name of God before it comes into the world. And this is going to be this level of Chatan, of the groom that comes into the world and is revealed godliness as a result of these two levels of Kala that we have. And that's what it means, Hu Levada, that God, before we praise him, he is alone, Yachid Yachid, he is unique and alone. The Ikr Chai Olamos, and all of that God enlivens the worlds, this is only from him being a king. Same thing as like him having a name. Because all of the worlds that God creates, Ishtaushlus Olamos, it's not just a way of cause and effect, like it writes in book. Because if so, there would be a change in God. We say that God does not change himself. Because if there was a cause and effect, there would be some sort of a change in the cause. Let's say, for instance, I'm speaking, and now that I speak, my voice goes into the recorder, and it comes out to you. So I'm causing the words. The words are like nothing compared to me, but I have to expend some sort of energy in order to make. That's called cause and effect. And God does not create the world by cause and effect. God creates the world something from nothing. How does he do that? And so he says because he creates the world is not created from God's essence. It's not, so to speak, God himself creating the world, so to speak. It's just a ray of godliness that creates the world. And this ray of godliness is incomparable to the essence of God. So therefore, we say that the source of this is called God's big name. That's God's big name. That's the Makar Chayas Olamas, is only just God's name alone. And what we want to do, when we praise God, so this draws down this source of the world, this big name of God, it draws it down into the world. And that's the idea of the Chatan, of the groom, coming down into the world. But we're going to see that there's two levels of this groom. One is that God reveals himself in a way of Mamale Kolmim, and the other one is that God reveals himself in a way of Soviv Kolmim, from above all the worlds. That's also revealed in the world, but that we'll have to talk about next time. And the source of this whole business is the song of King Solomon. A song is something that, a melody, it vibrates, it undulates, what's it called? And that's going back and forth. That's the Song of Songs. That's this whole song that the Jewish people, they devote themselves to God, and God reacts. They devote themselves to God in two ways, and God reacts. That's the song that's going back and forth between us. So we've talked about the two types of love that the Jews have for God, and we began to talk about the first reaction that God reacts to the world. That's called Mamali Kolmim, how it comes down into the world and a revelation, as we'll talk about more, God willing, next time.
First reaction of our calling.
That's right. God reacts. God reacts. So when we think about God and we arouse our love of God in these three, whatever different ways, anything, all our love. So God, all that, that type of love, that's called Mamali Kolmim, how God fills the world. This is thinking about God in relation to the world somehow. That's our Kala, how we have desire for God. And God reacts to that by revealing his name. But then there's a higher level of love that we can have for God, total expiring, being included in the oneness of God. That we talked about last time. What's God's reaction to that? We did not talk about the last time. This is going to be an upper pleasure of God, this level of tainug, God's upper pleasure, which is above all of the worlds. And that we're going to talk about next time. This is the eagle. It says that's the idea of King Solomon's song. A song is also like the surrounding world, because a song, the word for song is shir, and the word for a shir in Hebrew means a song, but it also means a ring, like a ring that's put on a finger is called a shir. And there's a Mishnah in Shabbat that it says it's forbidden for your animal to carry things for you on Shabbat. But if your animal always goes out with a shear, always goes out with a ring, let's say through its nose, then it's permissible to go out. It's called Bali Shir Yotzim B'Shir. All animals which always have this shear, this ring, then they can go out with that. But we say it also the same thing about the angels. The Bali Shir, the angels are singing. They sing the song, so the Yotzim B'Shir, their souls go out with the song. And so it is the Jewish people. That's going to be this ego, this surrounding level, and God willing, we'll talk about that next time. So we'll call me, how God reacts. Meanwhile, this is a lot of faith that we have to have because we don't see this clearly happening. And it's the thing that makes general great changes in the world, especially these levels of like how we're protected by this. So we don't know that all the dangers that are attacking us, we have no idea what they are. We just, because of our prayers and because of this, so God protects us. He puts a shield around us. And that's some of the Soviv Kolomian that surrounds all the worlds. It protects us. As we'll talk about, God willing, next time.
Thank you very much. Too bad that we got. Can you tell me?
Where do we get up to? We got up to here. 1 second.
I think it was more up.
I skipped a little. Yeah, I skipped a little.
Huh.
1 second. Here.
Till the Hine.
Hine. Right, this is going to be the song of the Torah. We'll talk about that next time. Okay?
Thank you.
Right. My pleasure. Have a good week with
You
Moshiach
too.
NOW.
All the best.
Shalom.
Chodesh Tov.
Chodesh Tov.